I am Steve LeSueur, and you are listening to Gospel Tangents.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology, and first daily Mormon history podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. You know, Mormons lived in the Wild West, and there were shootouts and that sort of thing, so I'm excited to talk to Steve LeSueur. He is the author of Life and Death on the Mormon Frontier, The Murders of Frank LeSueur and Gus Gibbons by the Wild Bunch. So this is a cool story because it involves Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So, we'll talk a little bit about him. He's kind of a Wild West person you may have heard of. He didn't kill Frank LeSueur and Gus Gibbons, so that's a little bit of a giveaway there. But we're going to talk more about this really interesting story in the Wild West. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have a return visitor back on the show. Tell us who you are.
I'm Steve LeSueur, and I am the author of a new book, Life and Death on the Mormon Frontier, The Murders of Frank LeSueur and Gus Gibbons by the Wild Bunch.
All right.
Published by Greg Koford Books.
Exactly. So Frank LeSueur, Steve LeSueur, there's got to be a relationship somehow.
Yeah, very good, very good. Yes, that Frank LeSueur is my great uncle, my father's uncle, my grandfather, Carl LeSueur's older brother.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the reason, and so that's why I'm interested in this, and in our family, in the LeSueur family, we've always known that my father's uncle, Frank LeSueur, has been killed by outlaws. That was, no surprise to us. But we knew few details. And my grandfather, Carl, Frank's younger brother, he was only 5 when Frank was killed. And so he didn't know too much himself and didn't tell us much at all. So to a large degree, that as far as I knew, and we all knew, that the killers got away, and there was, as far as we knew, little attempt to capture them, and it was just some minor episode in Western history. And so that's been the story for since 1900. However, in recent years, historians of outlaws, historians and biographers who were interested in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and other outlaws.
Who has Mormon ties as well.
Yeah, who has Mormon ties. We can get to that. Anyway, these historians started pointing fingers at Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch gang as the likely culprits. And so when I read that, that got me interested in the story. And so I started reading about it, but also from my perspective, reading the journals and diaries and reminiscences that the various Latter-day Saints left behind who were in the community there. And so that brought me in. It was the notoriety, of course, of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch that drew me in. But what I found was there was a story here to tell. And part of the story is that, when historians write about whether it's Butch Cassidy or Billy the Kid or Jesse James or other outlaws, they're interested in the outlaws, their daring heists and their exciting getaways and that kind of thing. And the victims, the people who get killed, they're kind of like bit players or extras in a movie that really aren't important, and it's understandable.
Crewman number 6, right?
Yeah, yes, exactly, exactly. And so, in looking at this from the victim's point of view, I found I had a pretty good story to tell of sort of the ramifications of this, and there were lots of insights then into the outlaws themselves as well as this community.
Wow! So not too many people have an ancestor killed by a famous outlaw.
Yes, so part of the what was interesting to me and really drew me in was that that this event took place in the year 1900.
Okay.
And so even though 1900 sounds somewhat modern, not like the Wild West, but it was. This was the town. It was just outside of a town of St. John's, Arizona, on the eastern part of Arizona, and it was a dusty cattle and sheep town. And there was no electricity. There was no running water in this town. And of course, it was an era, it was, cars and airplanes were unimagined. And so these were people on horseback. And so the this incident, in essence, just to set the stage. And so on March 27th, year 1900, that there were 14 to 16 posse members who were chasing 5 outlaws who were suspected of cattle rustling. And so through a variety of circumstances, unfortunate circumstances, at the end of the day, there were only 2 men chasing the outlaws, and the circumstances were, missed trails and bad judgment by some of the posse members, as well as just bad luck. At the end of the day, only Frank LeSueur and Gus Gibbons were on the trail of the outlaws.
Oh, wow. Well, very cool. So I'm trying to remember, I think St. John's, that was the home of one of the Oklahoma City bombers too. So that's just a bad place, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, the Mormons settled there in 1880. So
is this like John Taylor, St. John?
No, it was not. As you probably know, or your listeners know, that the Mormons, they arrived in Utah in 1847, and
Arizona was part of Utah back then.
Well, actually, it wasn't, but Brigham Young wanted it to be.
Right.
That he had his state of Deseret.
It was part of Deseret.
Yes, state of Deseret that included parts of California and practically all of Nevada. And all of what was Arizona at that time, as well as parts of New Mexico. So Mormon leaders had designs on moving all the way down south. It took them a while, but in any case, starting in the mid-1870s, they started populating the Little Colorado River corridor. The Little Colorado River feeds into the Colorado, and then in 1880. They called Mormon families to settle in St. John's, which was already an established town. It had been called San Juan, established by Mexican Americans, and there was about 400 living there.
Who's also St. John.
Yeah, it was also St. John. And so then it got anglicized to St. John's. And so more than 100 Mormon families were, called to come down there and settle, and hundreds along the Little Colorado River corridor. And so that was the genesis of them coming down there. And among the things that I found fascinating was there were several things. One is that this was a desolate area. That perhaps you remember J. Golden Kimball talking about St. George, living in St. George, of how harsh the environment was. He said, if I had a house in hell and a house in St. George, I would rent out the house in St. George and I'd live in hell. And the thing is that St. George was a paradise compared to some of these places along the Little Colorado River that people settled. For example, when the Brigham Young sent some explorers down, first to look into this area, they came back and called it things like it was an inhospitable waste. And another man said it was the most desert-looking place he'd ever seen. And part of the problem wasn't just the desert, but this Little Colorado River was filled with sand and silt, and so the water was not fit for human consumption. And so one resident said it was like a stream of moving mud. And another fellow talking about it, it was one of the tributaries. He said it was so red with silt that it looked like red paint that was mixed and ready to use. And so it was just a harsh, difficult environment. Though, with that said, reports came back to Salt Lake City, about these reports, and this was not necessarily a good place. And but to Mormon leaders, that was fine. I'll read you what this is what George Q. Cannon, who was one of Brigham Young's counselors, he said regarding this. He said, "Good countries are not for us." He said, "The worst places in the land we can probably get, and we must develop them." He said, "If we were to find good country, how long would it be before the wicked would want it and seek to strip us of our possessions?" So among the things I found fascinating was, that most of us are familiar with Utah history and the Latter-day Saints settling Utah and lots of the history surrounding that. Less well known is the history of Mormon settlement in Arizona. We know they went down there, but less is known. Well, this was just a very interesting tale of how these people arrived there and, well, what they were doing tangling with outlaws in the first place. And to that idea of, well, outlaws is another interesting aspect of this was that St. John's and and Apache County, where the Latter-day Saints were living, this was the Wild West that we see in movies and television and fiction. I mean, we're talking cattle rustling, horse stealing, thievery, and lynchings and the like. It was
Counterfeiting?
and yes, and counterfeiting.
Because Marianne Clements, she's my counterfeiting expert, especially in Nauvoo, but I'm sure she doesn't know anything about Arizona.
Yeah, well,
Maybe she'll start looking into this.
The counterfeiting I know of is that what some people did and were thrown in jail. This weren't Mormons, but county warrants. That when Apache County and any counties, when they didn't have enough money to pay their bills or pay for services, they would write out warrants, essentially promises to pay, like say, here's a promise to pay for $10 for service. Well, forging warrants was what you would do is it was said $10. Well, you just put another zero on the end, and then you'd put it in the bank and say, here's a county warrant for $100. And so that did go on.
Okay.
But
That's just check fraud.
Yeah, yes. But anyway, numerous gangs operated in this region. And again, I'll rely on a couple of quotes here. But one of the things is this man, Charlie Kinnear, who was an associate of the Clanton gang and the Clanton brothers. And if you remember, the Clanton family, they were two of the families that fought the Earp brothers at the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Oh.
And that was in Tombstone, south of Apache County, in 1881.
Tombstone, Arizona.
Tombstone, Arizona. And so after the gunfight at the OK Corral, two of the surviving Clanton members, Ike Clanton and Finn Clanton, they moved north into Apache County, into Springerville, and they were reputed to, among other things, to rustle Mormon cattle and then run them down to Mexico for sale. But in any case, this man was, Charlie Kinnear, was an associate of theirs. And here's what he said about living in Apache County. What he said was, of all the places I've ever been, and in all my association with bad men, I had never seen as bad a collection as was in Apache County. And then just one more quote for you is James LeSueur, who was Frank LeSueur's older brother. He said in his reminiscence about what it was like growing up in St. John's, he said cowboys would ride through the town shooting and yelling. They set up gambling dens and bawdy houses in St. John's and Holbrook. Drunkenness, together with its attendant crime, flourished in the very doors of the saints. So again, what I found interesting was the saints were settling it right there in the Wild West, and it created a lot of dilemmas for them of well, how do we preserve our Christian standards and justice and law, but in a place where guns and violence seem to be necessary sometimes.
Wow. So they're having the high noon shootouts and everything. It sounds like this sort of a thing.
Yeah, they weren't, of course, common. Those types of shootouts were not common affairs, but the rustling was always a problem there. Mm-hmm. And though there was one shootout in St. John's itself in 1882, and that occurred when there was the genesis of this was there was a Mormon family, came from Texas, the Greer family, and they were cattlemen. And there were brothers running a cattle farm or a cattle ranch, and it was the days of open grazing. Well, the Mexican-American community that already lived there, a lot of them were sheep herders. And so the Greer family of cattlemen and the Mexican-Americans often got in conflict. The Greer brothers would run off the sheep from and break up the camps of the Mexican Americans, and then the Mexican American sheep herders might go scatter their cattle and that type of thing. So, in any case, there was animosity there, and in 1882 when the Mexican-American community was holding their annual San Juan Day celebration in San Juan, or in St. John's. It was a parade, and they had bands, and they even magicians and a bullfight. Well, the Greer brothers were warned by Mormon leaders not to come because there was probably going to be trouble, but they came anyway. And sure enough, they were first ordered to hand in their guns to be as part being in the celebration itself, and they refused. And anyway, soon shots were ringing out, and it was one of those occasions where there were shots across the street. People were scattering everywhere, and as it ended up, 2 men were killed, one of the Greer cowboys, and several people injured as well. And so, but anyway, that was an example of this kind of shootout, and the dilemma for Mormons was also exemplified by the Greer men, who, some Mormons disliked them, thought they were sort of a source of trouble when we're trying to get along with the community. But many other Mormons liked them because these were men with Texas swagger, and they felt like the Greer men protected them. And there was one diary account I read was a reminiscence, but of somebody saying, that at church there was a discussion among the people of one of the men said, "Oh, those Greer boys, if they would just go on missions, all our troubles would be over. If they went on missions like everybody else, all our troubles would be over." And then another man by the name of Charlie Riggs said, "Missions? Go on missions?" He said, "Who would be here to protect us?" And so anyway, that was an example of sort of the dilemma of that. Anyway, you got me off on that tangent because you asked about shootouts.
Exactly. Well, this is kind of fun. We don't think, Mormons were involved in the Wild West, absolutely, and so it's kind of fun to hear
Butch Cassidy.
Butch Cassidy. I was thinking Billy the Kid, but I meant Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Gang. And you did say there was a relationship with Gus Gibbons and the Wild Bunch with Butch Cassidy. Is that right?
Actually, not exactly. But though you bring it up that Gus Gibbons' father was Bill Gibbons, and one of his cousins, Charlie Gibbons, who lived in Utah, was not an associate of the gang, but apparently were the gang, and I can't remember where he lived. So, but anyway, he knew Butch Cassidy, but that was the only association.
Pretty distant.
Yeah, pretty distant. But anyway, so talking about Outlaws and the book, and what's new, or what was fascinating to me, in any case, is that people of my era, we grew up with the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and but other TV shows and movies too sort of often portray outlaws as, well, they're really misunderstood individuals. They're Robin Hood characters. They look out for the people in their neighborhood, and that they've just had some bad breaks and that kind of thing, and and even and that they they're not robbing the little guys, and even the Sundance Kid, in an interview with somebody, this is in my book, he said, well, we only rob the railroads and the banks who can afford our requisitions. And so, any case, that's sort of the myth of them. But at least the events, that I found in this book, the murders, these murders and some others that they perpetrated, these were not people who were looking out for the little guy. They were looking out for themselves. And although they were skilled gunmen, but they were never looking for a fair fight. Their ambush was their preferred method of attack, and they weren't opposed to shooting somebody in the back, even an unarmed man in the back. That was not against their morals.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with author Steve LeSueur, author of Life and Death on the Mormon Frontier. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Butch Cassidy and some of the other outlaws that were involved in Mormon communities in Arizona.
And Butch Cassidy and his gang were actually, just a little bit prior to this, they were operating in the town of Alma, New Mexico, which is, I think, about 110 miles away on a ranch. It was the WS Ranch. And they were working there. They were cowhands. And in fact, Butch Cassidy was a trail boss. And they were very highly valued cowhands. Their foreman, a man by the name of Captain William French, he wrote a reminiscence about his time in New Mexico, including when these gang members were there, though he didn't know they were gang members at the time.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, subscribe on either Patreon or at gospeltangents.com. For just $5 a month, you can hear the entire audio uninterrupted. On our $10 tier, if you would like to see the whole video, you can see that either on youtube.com/gospeltangents, or I've got a special Facebook group devoted for full videos. So subscribe at gospeltangents.com and sign up for just $10 a month. For $20 a month, if you'd like to get some bonus content, maybe some of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor, you can sign up for that. And then if you'd like to talk to me for $100 a month, we'll do a monthly phone call on something like Zoom, and you can ask me anything you want. So thanks again. Also, don't forget about the merch, mugs, t-shirts, hats, things like that. I'm trying to get the ties up there. Hopefully I can get up there. And thanks again for watching Gospel Tangents, and click here for some more videos.